I call the clerk.
Government Business, Order of the Day number 5. Australian Government responds to the final report of the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability. Ministerial statement, resumption of debate on the motion of the Minister for Social Services.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Disability Royal Commission was an enormous undertaking of 4.5 years and an important and vital piece of work. Almost 10,000 people shared their experiences through almost 8,000 submissions and 32 public hearings. And the evidence was shocking. In Adelaide, we've had some shocking, well-known cases where people have died in terrible situations. One particularly well-known and horrific case, which made the media and resulted in convictions, is every person with disability's nightmare and every family and carer's nightmare. Her family had set her up well. She had a trust fund, she had a home that was owned freehold. And yet, following the death of her parents, she was neglected by paid providers, literally left to rot in a chair in her living room, unable to get to the toilet or feed herself. Her money and her possessions, including jewellery, were stolen from her, and she died an horrific death. As a carer, as a parent, as someone who has a caring responsibility for a person with a disability, as someone who gets around in the disability sector, I can tell you this is our biggest fear. That despite every effort to uphold the dignity, the rights, the safety of people with disability, that this can have happened. So I'd really like to thank the 10,000 people who told their stories, shared their experience, their knowledge, their ideas. And sadly but necessarily, they also shared their experiences of violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation. This is hard to hear, but it's vital information. Lived experience evidence is the most important. It ground truths the other evidence. So hearing from all those people, people with disability, their carers, their families, their advocates, has informed the 222 recommendations that range from safety to human rights, to inclusion and access to mainstream services like health and education. The recommendations covered multiple portfolios and all levels of government, and of these recommendations, 172 are the sole or joint responsibility of the Commonwealth. Of these, 130 have been accepted or accepted in principle. Accepted in principle means the policy intent of the recommendation has been accepted, and I want to reassure the disability community that we have heard them and we have listened. We are taking action and we are committed to driving real change across all aspects of society. We are committed to the vision set out in the Royal Commission that people with disability live free from violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation, where human rights are protected, where individuals live with dignity, equality and respect and fulfil their potential, where people with and without disability can live, learn, work, play, create and engage together in safe and diverse communities, where people with disability have the power of choice, independence and the dignity to take risks, where people with disabilities make significant contributions to communities that value their presence and treat them with respect, and that people with disabilities are culturally safe and belong in families, communities and peer networks. The response to the Royal Commission is a joint response of all Commonwealth and state and territory governments. It provides a clear commitment that all levels of government are working together, and we will work in partnership with people with a disability to determine the most appropriate and impactful way to implement reform in response to the recommendations. There are 36 recommendations that require further consideration because they relate to ongoing or recently concluded inquiries or negotiations, or they require further consideration in consultation with people with a disability. There are 6 recommendations that are noted, and there are a further 50 that fall entirely within the responsibility of state or territory governments, and so a response will need to come from those governments. As a federal government, we will continue to be accountable for the progress of those recommendations that are our joint or sole responsibility through 6-monthly reporting on implementation progress. However, as a government, we have not waited for the final report of the Disability Royal Commission to take action to improve the lives of Australians with disability. Our $371 million commitment towards the first phase of its response to the Disability Royal Commission builds on over $3 billion of the last 3 budgets to improve the lives and safety of people with disability in Australia. We are taking action through the 4 key pillars that reflect the areas of the disability community told us are important to them: better safeguarding, promoting inclusion and accessibility, upholding human rights, and recognising the unique perspectives and experiences of First Nations people with a disability. Implementing and embedding our shared vision for an inclusive Australia requires a sustained national effort from all Australian governments. This Australian government commits to strengthening safeguards, independent oversight and complaint mechanisms. We commit to listening to the diverse voices of people with a disability and working in partnership to design, implement and evaluate policies and programs that drive reform. We commit to upholding the human rights of people with a disability to enable them to live with dignity, equality and respect. And this Australian government commits to promoting a more inclusive society where people with disability feel that they belong, so that they are respected, they are valued and they are able to fully contribute. Our focus is on fixing problems, but not just that. Our focus is also on creating a better future where people with disability are valued, respected and supported to live their lives with dignity. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The member for Tangi.
I move that the debate be adjourned and the resumption of the debate be made on an order of the day for a later hour this day or the next sitting.
The question is that the debate be adjourned and that the resumption of the debate be made in order of the day for a later hour this day or the next sitting. All of that opinion say aye? Aye. All those against, no? I think the ayes have it. Clerk.
Committee and Delegation Business, Order of the Day number 1, Standing Committee on Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, Drowning in Waste, Plastic Pollution in Australia's Ocean and Waterways, resumption of debate on the motion of the member for Macon.
The question is that the document be noted and I call the member for Lyne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Plastic pollution in Australia's oceans and waterways was the issue of our very extensive inquiry and has been labelled drowning in waste for a very good reason, because literally at the moment we have a problem with waste in Australia. We have put a ban in place, but we have a disrupted and not a complete circular economy for plastic waste in this country, and waste is building up everywhere. But the good news is that we've made some recommendations which will hopefully fix a lot of those problems. First of all, I'd like to thank every one of the hundreds of submitters and very extensive submissions that were presented to the committee as we went around Australia. There are an enormous amount of community organisations, philanthropic organisations and some standout councils and state and local government organisations that are on the job, but there's much more to do. I'd also like to thank the Secretariat of the committee, who managed huge volumes of information and submission, put it into a coherent set of data, because there was so much information. To distill it all down was quite an amazing set of work. I'd like to thank all the other committee members and our chair, the member for Macon, who steered us through a very useful inquiry. But what I'd like to do is put not a holistic blow-by-blow description of this excellent report, but the things that I think are the most important and will lead to the most dramatic improvement in preventing plastic waste polluting our oceans and waterways. Because whether it's the microplastic issue, which is getting small amounts of plastics that are ubiquitous in metropolitan life into our food chain through fish and other marine animals, through to the macro large plastic waste, which is suffocating sea mammals like whales, dolphins, turtles, etc., but also some of the micro and the large practice getting into the marine seafood, so amongst these issues, the things that I thought that I should acknowledge, that there was a lot documented, all the good things that have happened because of the National Plastics Plan. And I would just like to give a shout out and a nod to my former colleague, former member for Brisbane, Trevor Evans, who led that legislation when he was a minister with this responsibility in the Morrison government. He addressed a lot of the problems in the whole life cycle of marine plastic and waterway plastic and how to reduce it. We had many people who pointed out that there are missing gaps in our current National Plastics Plan. The first thing was that the concept, if we put a value on the plastic, it's only waste if you waste it, and you can apply that principle to lots of things. But plastic is not waste. It has embedded energy in it, and we need to start using that, and I'll expand on that a bit further. But a lot of the depositions related to the fact that we have plastics that are easy to recycle and plastics that are hard to recycle, and they have accentuated that we need to get the plastics that are essential in our life to be the PET, the high density polyethylene, the low density polyethylene, and polypropylene, because the clever industrial chemists can put that to the best use. The more complex polymers are harder to recycle. Now, by virtue of the Recycling and Waste Reduction Act that Trevor Evans, the former member for Brisbane, and Scott Morrison were influential in putting in place, means we have a recycling manufacturing fund that's been set up, and we have a national product stewardship fund, which has led to major changes, some of whom were involved in the people doing the depositions to this inquiry. But we still have a fragmented market. The ban is in place, so we can't export it, but there's not enough entities involved in reprocessing the built-up plastic that we are now banning from being exported. And people are turning to fresh virgin plastic in new presentations rather than utilising this market. There were recommendations for microfibre filters on every washing machine, and that was from back in that original National Plastics Plan, but we haven't enacted that, so we need to do that. As I mentioned, some councils are already doing really good things with storm waters and filters at that macro local council level, but many more things can be done in that same vein, and making it uniform or mandatory across the country. The Ghost Net initiative, these big nets and bits of plastic that are left over from commercial fishing are a big problem, particularly suffocating whales, dolphins, turtles, all sorts of stuff. And there is a Ranger program. The other, to address that, a lot of the areas in the north of Australia are really quite affected by this, because a lot of these plastics don't actually come from Australia, but they can end up in that northern part of Australia. But some of the recommendations that would address this would be recommendation 3, where we recommend the government prioritise more to get a sustainable end market for recovered plastics, and also we need to increase the disposal options for plastics in remote and regional Australia, because a lot of these plastic initiatives are all metropolitan based. Now, my particular interest out of this committee was to get recommendation 12 up. And I think rather than banning plastics, the best way to get them not wasted is to get a value out of them. Many countries overseas have addressed this by turning waste into energy, either by just simple incineration, but there are chemical processes where the feedstock is the end-of-life plastics and it goes back through chemical processes, providing energy itself, and then with refining, you can turn plastics that would have ended up in a waste pile, in landfill or in a river or out at sea, by turning it back into what it started as high purity diesel, a gas, and even petroleum and kerosene, because the engineering does exist for that. And many cities in Europe have waste-to-energy plants in the middle of their cities, but they're dressed up with hills and vegetation or elaborate architecture, and people don't even know that they're an energy plant using the city's waste. So there's many things that we could do, but we really need to get going with putting a value on plastic waste for everyone in their home, because we have so many clothes that are made of plastic, synthetics. The waste can be filtered out at the place it's developed, and we can do that by setting standards on white good manufacturers. We can encourage states at COAG meetings to institute filters on all the storm waters, depending on what the state they're in. But I commend this report to the House. It is a very good report. It's got a huge lot of useful information. And again, I'd like to thank all the committee and all my colleagues and all those people, particularly that are active in the industry of preventing waste from polluting our oceans. But we really need to engage with our Asian and near North neighbours to see if we can get the same rigour applied to their metropolitan and regional practices, particularly in the fishing industry, where a lot of these plastics really have high impact on the marine life. I commend drowning in waste to the Parliament. Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. With the indulgence of the members in the room, we know that there is a valedictory occurring in the House, which has delayed some members from making it here in time to make their speeches. So we just will suspend the Federation Chamber for a brief moment to allow... Oh, we won't suspend, and no need to apologise. Member for Warringah, just take your time. No, please don't apologise. The previous speaker, the other speaker on the list, isn't available to make a contribution. So thank you very much for making your way to the chamber earlier than expected. And I give the call to the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss this very important review. And I first want to start by thanking the committee, the secretarial staff that I know worked very hard in bringing it together. We had a number of public hearings, a significant number of submissions, and also we did a number of in-person visits around the country. And it was incredibly instructive to see the submissions by so many in that process. I would also like to thank some organisations in Warringah that are doing a fantastic job of addressing the problems of plastics and microplastics. Of course, Warringah is a place with many waterways. We have Manly Dam, we have many harbour coves and inlets, and then we have beaches. And so we can see firsthand that impact plastics and microplastics have on our water and environment and waterways. And as this report identifies, we are drowning in waste. So I would like to start by thanking organisations like OSMAP, who in fact made submissions and gave evidence to the inquiry, but also who actually started one of their programs in Warringah around East Esplanade in Manly. And it's a program where they really monitor how much plastics and microplastics they find in that area. It is citizen science, it is volunteer-based, and they turn up on a very regular basis to monitor that plastic content. Other organisations like Strawcool and Pittwater Eco Adventures are doing a phenomenal job on a very regular basis of cleaning up some of those harbour beaches. Because unfortunately, maybe differently to surf beaches, the harbour beaches accumulate a huge amount of rubbish and plastics that's come off boats and, I guess, recreational activities in our harbour. As this report has identified, plastic is everywhere. It's overrunning our streets, our parks, our beaches, our coastlines. This report, appropriately titled Drowning in Waste, lays out quite plainly that we need to take action. Australians consume more single-use plastic per person than any other country in the world, bar Singapore. Now, I know a lot of Australians think that we're doing good. We think we're good global citizens, and we think we're quite engaged with recycling and being plastic aware. But this statistic shows we are not doing as well as we think. So I repeat, we are the highest, except for Singapore, we consume the most single-use plastic per person than any other country. So clearly we have to do better. In 2020-2021, Australia used 3.79 million tonnes of plastic, of which only 14% was recycled. So we are huge contributors to this problem. Around 130,000 tonnes of plastic leak into the environment annually, including into our oceans and waterways. There are currently 150 million metric tonnes of plastic of pollution in the ocean, and by 2040, global plastic pollution is expected to double, with the ocean's plastic pollution expected to more than quadruple. By 2050, the amount of plastic waste in the environment could increase to 26 billion tonnes if no action is taken. And it gets worse. The breakdown of plastics into microplastics poses further risks to marine life, leads to blockages in their digestive system, malnutrition and death. And it really is no surprise that many are so concerned. Plastic pollution is a global crisis, and it's harming our environment, our wildlife, and ultimately us. There isn't much data yet on showing the impact on human life of that ingestion of plastic, but the ingestion is happening. So key facts, as highlighted in the report, are that we have a massive issue. There's a huge problem that we must act on because we are quite literally drowning in plastic. The key recommendation of this report is for the National Plastics Plan to be updated. In particular, the report notes that the plan should contain reporting and transparency measures to monitor progress and accountability among all stakeholders and be based on an overarching circular economy strategy. And it needs to be developed with stakeholders to promote sustainable practices and recycling and responsible waste management. And, of course, transition plans. Now, this is incredibly urgent, and our current National Plastic Plan is a disjointed one, with some goals included in the original plan already achieved prior to the plan's development. So it sort of begs the question of what is it really achieving. Stakeholders told our committee that they were lukewarm at best about the current plan, and so a new plan must urgently be developed in consultation with state and territory governments, industry and community, coordinated nationally to prioritise industry accountability. So most importantly though, I feel strongly that what we need is the problem around plastics and the responsibility must shift back to manufacturers. The committee found that manufacturers find it cheaper and easier to use virgin polymers rather than recycled materials in plastic products, which means we are continually making the problem worse. We are adding more and more and more plastic to the system. So this use of virgin polymers for that new plastics is a problem. Virgin polymers are manufactured using unrecycled and unused materials. It's ultimately oil, right? This is big oil wanting to maintain the addiction on plastics so that we continue to use their product. But technology has moved. We know we can use much more recycled content. And so that must be the direction we need to go in. We heard submissions to the committee that believe the federal government should implement a tax or a levy that specifically targets virgin plastic to discourage its consumption or use and promote the use of recycled materials. Whilst the committee has recommended investigating such a levy on the use of virgin polymer, it did fall short from actually requiring that become mandatory. I'm concerned that for a long time we've been waiting for this. We've had industry voluntary codes, and I believe time's up, that we've had decades of lacklustre action from manufacturers and industry, and it's time actually for them to have their house in order. The government should be implementing mandates for minimum recycled content for any plastics imported, and they should be mandating limits on the number of polymer variations. So put it in layman's term, the number of variations to the recipes or types of plastics that are manufactured. Because unfortunately the catch is to establish a good recycling industry, the difficulty is the more polymers, variations of polymers we have, the types of plastics, the harder it is to actually establish proper recycling supply chains and then the circular economy aspects for all the different types. And if you limited it down to less numbers of them, more specific ones, you could then facilitate much higher amount of recycling, which is incredibly important. Now, microplastics, of course, they are the much tinier pellets and smaller pieces of plastic, and they are more insidious and get into more areas. Essentially, it's a small piece of plastic less than 5 millimetres long, and they are found everywhere in all parts of our environment, all over the globe. They've even made it into polar regions and in foods such as sea salt and beer, so it's everywhere. Studies around the world are showing that microplastics can carry harmful chemicals and toxins, but we're still learning the full extent to which microplastics may be harmful. And they're everywhere, and it is a reminder, sometimes technology might create progress, but sometimes it takes us backwards. There was a lot of concern raised about artificial turf when it comes to playing fields for sport, a lot of concerns about the plastic rubber that is used in play gym equipment. All of those uses of plastic do not adequately, well, we do not require adequate, I guess, protection of drainage around them. And so they leak into the environment, they leak into small particles, and that creates a huge amount of microplastic in the surrounding environments from those types of areas. So it's really important that the recommendations are addressing a number of issues in relation to this report, and I hope the government does take note of this. We also saw, of course, Indigenous communities and First Nations Australia's efforts in reducing plastics in our environment. So we have a lot of expertise, a huge amount of, I think, willingness. When I visit every school in Warringah, there's always plastic-free Wednesdays and days where there's, a focus by young people on limiting it. But clearly we need to sheet it back home to manufacturers who are still producing too much plastic and having too much in the system. Thank you.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Cook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First, I'd just like to acknowledge the member for Bass and the rest of the committee for the great work they've done. I was not a part of it, but it's a topic that's very close to my heart. It's also close to the heart of a lot of people in my electorate. Cook and much of Australia's way of life is built around the water. 87% of Australians live around the water. Cook has the Pacific Ocean to the east, the Georges River to the north, and the Hacking River to the south. And many in my electorate and many in our country enjoy these waterways. And our country as well, surrounded by the Pacific, the Southern and the Indian Oceans. It's really a huge part of our identity as Australians, but also for people who live in my electorate enjoying these waterways. And plastic pollution is threatening that enjoyment of Australians, that enjoyment of people in my electorate. It's also threatening biodiversity, and it's also threatening human health. It's a significantly growing issue. There's currently 150 million metric tonnes of pollution in the ocean. And according to Australian Marine Conservation Society, on current trends, there will be more plastic than fish in our ocean by 2050. 3/4 of the pollution on Australia's coastline is made up by plastic, and plastics account for about 80% of all marine debris. It's a huge threat to biodiversity. Entanglement in abandoned and lost discarding fishing gear known as ghost nets, plastic bags, ropes, clothing, six-pack rings, some of the most common items to injure sea turtles, marine mammals, seabirds, whales, sea lions and others. And when this marine life ingests plastics, it can block their digestive system, causing a long and slow death from starvation. Chemical additives leach into the air, the water, the soil, and much of this is toxic to animals and, yes, can be toxic to humans as well. These toxic additives that are absorbed can accumulate in the food chain and actually pass from fish to humans. A particularly intractable problem in plastics are things such as BPAs, flame retardants and heavy metals. The presence of these materials in recycled plastics limits its use in consumer products with high potential for human exposure, such as food packaging. Higher up in the food chain, when ingested by humans, microplastics can damage cells in the human body, leading to serious health impacts, and there has been linkages in academic studies to cancers, lung diseases and birth defects. During use and also disposal, plastics release microplastic and nanoplastic fragments, along with thousands of toxic chemicals, including additives, residual monomers, into the environment and into people. Plastic additive chemicals can disrupt endocrine functions, and there has been studies linking it to risks for premature births, neurodevelopment disorders, male reproductive birth defects, infertility, obesity, cardiovascular disease, renal disease, and even cancers. Now, these need to be investigated more, but there is increasingly mounting evidence. And it's particularly hazardous for children. Exposures have been linked with pregnant mothers as well, with a lot of other different things, and cancers. Early life exposure to plastics is actually being linked to increased risk of non-communicable diseases such as heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity in children across the human lifespan. Now look, we have a big problem. That's what that tells us. There is a big emerging problem, and the trends in actually the disposal and recyclable in plastic, well look, we need to reduce, reuse and recycle. They're the three traditional levers you have in plastic management. Now, these strategies have proven highly effective for paper, cardboard, glass and aluminium, but have largely failed when it comes to plastic. Plastic recovery and recycling rates are below 10% globally. 90% of plastics are not reduced, reused or recycled. They're actually disposed of into our ecosystem. Australia ranks 15th in the world for generation of single-use plastics. That's absolutely terrible for a country of our standing and for a country where we have the care about the environment in our population. We have released in 2018 national plastic targets that for 2025, the idea that would be 100% of packaging would be reusable or recyclable or compostable, 70% of plastic would be recycled or composted, 50% would be the average recycled plastic, including in packaging, and we'd be phasing out single-use plastic. I think it's safe to say we are going to fail abysmally to achieving those 2025 targets. The proportion of recyclable packaging has decreased from 86 to 84%, though there was a change to the score, so maybe it's a bit muddy there, but it's not going up. The plastic recycling rate increased from 18 to 20%, way off the 70% target. The average recycled content of packaging has increased by a mere 1 percentage point from 39 to 40, and problematic and unnecessary single-use plastic has been reduced from 33% from the 27 to 2018 baseline. So, look, I do think if industry cannot get their act together, it makes the case for government intervention and regulation. I think when plastic in our external environment is an externality, and it's an unpriced externality. I think that my opening monologue, you could hear the damage it is doing to the environment, to biodiversity, and potentially to human health. And I think if industry is not acting to do that, we need to start pricing that externality. And I think the warning to industry is if they don't get their act together soon, that will be priced. And I think the opportunity for Australian industry here is, to borrow an ice hockey term, maybe it's out of place in Australia here, but from my time in the US, the puck is moving in that direction. So if Australian industry, and we have a very successful and proud and successful packaging industry in Australia, be it Amcor or Pratt Manufacturing, but if Australian innovators can get their act together and see the puck is moving in this direction, there is going to be a huge economic opportunity globally to get either recycled or substitute manufacturing, packaging manufacturing economic opportunities for this country. There'll be jobs. It'll become a huge export industry. And domestically, we also need to look at recycling programs. Sorting is a huge problem, and even the technology involved in sorting, when we're only getting 10% of plastic being recycled, that's largely a sorting problem. And it's not a uniquely Australian problem. This is a global problem, and more dollars will be going here. We need a sustainable market for recycled plastics, and again, that may at some stage look at a tax or a levy or some sort of pricing mechanism for that. Reducing consumption. State governments and federal governments need to work together here to work out how we reduce consumption of that. And regulation. There is a need for regulation here, and look, I would prefer that be a market mechanism, but we have an externality, and that externality is not being dealt with, and it's not being dealt with effectively. And I think over time, look, let me be also direct, the reason people are using plastic is it's got a lot of great properties. It's cheap, it's flexible, it's good to produce. So it's quick to produce and easy to produce. So there is a market product there, but we now have evidence of the damage it is doing. And with the damage it's doing to enjoyment of human waterways, marine biodiversity, and human health, we do need to start acting. There is innovation and dollars going towards it, but I do think it is similar to energy policy with net zero, where there is a case for regulation of government and potentially pricing this. So I think if I was an Australian manufacturer out there in this industry, I think there's a huge opportunity to actually start moving towards this, a huge economic opportunity, not just domestically, but an export opportunity. And I would love to see Australian companies taking the lead in that, capturing a global market and doing great stuff. Look, a couple of things. I'd like to make a couple of shout outs to businesses I have seen doing that. Cyclus in Indonesia is making products as much as 40% cheaper while providing a refill cart for food and cleaning items such as soap to reduce single plastic waste use. And I'd just like to call out one person in my electorate, Cal Glanzig, a local resident who's produced a film, Rising Up. Rising Up is an epic film that discusses the problem of plastics and then talks about the many innovators in the private sector who are starting to solve this problem. So I am filled with hope. I do think this is a solvable problem, and there are technologies out there that begin to solve it today.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Plastic pollution is a significant threat to the world's marine and freshwater ecosystems. This recent report by the House's Standing Committee on Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water highlights the size of this challenge. All of the plastic that we have ever produced is still in existence. It will take between 500 and 1,000 years to degrade. On average, Australians use 130 kilograms of plastic per person per year. That's more single-use plastics than almost any other country. Only 14% of the plastics from Australia are recycled. As much as 130,000 tonnes of plastic leak into our environment every single year. And the CSIRO has found that 3/4 of the waste, the rubbish on the Australian coastlines, is plastic. Globally, the figures are even worse. Plastic waste makes up 80% of all marine pollution. If we think about that horrible, horrible thing, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch alone, it is the biggest accumulation of plastic waste in the world. It includes an estimated total of 1.8 trillion pieces of plastic waste. That's 250 pieces of plastic for every human on the planet. It's inconceivable. This is a plastic rubbish heap, which is 17 times the size of Tasmania. Deputy Speaker, by 2050, the plastic in our oceans will outweigh the fish. The plastic that litters our rivers and our seas comes from our clothes. It comes from packaging. It's detritus from our workplaces and our homes. It's leftovers from barbecues, kids' parties, sporting events. All of it leaks because of poor waste management, stormwater runoff and illegal dumping. Its effects on marine life are disastrous. As many as 100,000 marine animals and 1 million seabirds are killed by plastic every year. Abandoned fishing gear and nets are particularly harmful. They entangle and kill turtles, seabirds, even dolphins. But the effects on humans are also of serious concern. We know now that microplastics and nanoplastics are everywhere. They're in our drinking water, they're in our soil. They carry chemicals on their surfaces, they cross the placenta and the blood-brain barrier. We don't yet understand their health implications for us and for future generations. So far, Australia's approach to plastic waste has been fragmented and inadequate. We've had a number of national plans from this and previous governments which have been aimed at reducing plastic waste, but all have focused more on recovery, particularly on recycling, not on reducing the production and consumption of plastics in the first place, which logically is where we should start. The inexorable growth in the plastics waste generated in this country in recent years has shown us that these policies are not working. This committee's report calls for an updated plan with specific and measurable goals and for stronger industry accountability. But it also highlights the need for a sustainable end market for recycled plastics. We do need to standardise bans on single-use plastics and waste collection standards across all Australian states and territories. We need to fund Indigenous ranger programs to support their work in cleaning up our marine debris, and we should encourage the primacy of First Nations participation in our international negotiations regarding plastic pollution. It's absolutely vital that the government works with all states and territories and the scientific experts, including particularly the CSIRO, to limit the plastic debris which enters our marine environment via stormwater. But of course, the very best measure, returning to the theme, is reduction of our use of plastics. 49% of all marine pollution that comes out of Australia results from the use of single-use plastics. All of us can act on this. We can use reusable rather than plastic bags. We can reduce our use of disposable plastic cups. We can buy food and cleaning products in bulk, and we can transport them in glass or metal containers rather than plastic ones. At a government level, a tax on plastic packaging in Australia would likely be an effective measure. We've seen similar taxes imposed in Europe with great effect. Extended producer responsibility schemes have also shown promise overseas and have been highlighted in this report as a possible means to decreasing our plastic pollution. Deputy Speaker, plastic pollution is a global issue and Australia needs to play a leading role in international efforts to combat it. This report supports the development of a legally binding international treaty on plastic pollution, and it encourages Australia to facilitate the participation of smaller nations in those discussions. This important drowning and waste report provides a clear roadmap for addressing the urgent and important issues of plastic pollution in Australia. By implementing its recommendations, we can reduce plastic pollution, we can safeguard our marine life, and we can lead the way regionally in the global efforts to end this concerning crisis.
And I call the member... Oh, you're... Okay. Sorry, you just weren't on the list, so you're making a contribution towards Take Note, Drowning and Waste? Great, excellent, okay. And I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on drowning in waste, plastic pollution in Australia's ocean and waterways, the recent report of the Standing Committee on Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. As the member for North Sydney, I have the great privilege of living in and representing a community with a significant amount of harbour foreshore and other waterways in one of the most beautiful cities in the world. This stunning environment is a key part of the fabric of our community for our social connection at parks, our recreation, our mental health, our exercise, our children's sport and the well-being of our pets. More broadly, water is an iconic part of Australia's cultural identity. From our world-renowned beaches, stunning smaller islands, World Heritage sites such as the Great Barrier Reef, Ningaloo Reef and Catherine Gorge, and the collective pride we share in our world champion swimmers, sailors, surfers and water polo players. More critically, water is of course essential for life. Because of our intimate connection to water, Australians have a visceral sensitivity to the idea of drowning. And so I have no doubt that my community feels the findings of this report incredibly deeply. Now we are drowning in waste. We know from the very title of the committee's report that plastic pollution poses a significant threat to Australia's biodiversity, human health and our oceans and waterways due to the harm it causes to us directly and to marine and freshwater life and ecosystems. Shockingly, Australians consume more single-use plastic per person than any other country in the world, except Singapore. New research from the CSIRO estimates that every minute across the globe, a garbage truck's worth of plastic enters the ocean. Up to 11 million tonnes of larger items of plastic pollution, from nets and cups to plastic bags and everything in between, is sitting on the ocean floor, clustered around continents. These enormous amounts of plastic are disproportionately affecting our incredible regional and remote coastal locations. Although inland and coastal seas cover much less surface area than the oceans, just 11% versus 56% of our entire Earth's area, these areas are predicted to hold as much plastic mass as does the rest of the ocean floor. And of course, we see a lot of this plastic locally on our harbour foreshore before it gets to the ocean, most notably on Clean Up Australia Day, where the most common type of litter reported in Australia was soft plastic, followed by single-use plastic. This has certainly been reflected in the litter my volunteers and I have collected each year on that day. At the same time, we face the threat of microplastics and forever chemicals everywhere, including our very drinking water. Recently, to the concern of many, including my community of North Sydney, Australian media reported potentially unsafe levels of forever chemicals detected in drinking water supplies around Australia. These include human-made chemicals classed under the broader category of PFAS chemicals, the same ones United States authorities warn can cause cancer over a long period of time, with reports warning there is no safe level of exposure. Microplastics have now been found in all environments, including polar regions, from Mount Everest to the deepest ocean, in food such as sea salt and beer, and by the next year it's predicted that 99% of seabirds will have ingested some form of plastic. Barely a month goes by without a new alarming headline on the prevalence of microplastics. Just this year we've already heard the following. The first was, microplastics found in every human testicle in study. Scientists say discovery may be linked to decades-long decline in sperm counts in men around the world. The other headline was microplastics found in every human placenta tested in study. Scientists expressed concern over health impacts, with another study finding particles in arteries. It's no surprise that each aspect of this toxic onslaught is a matter of profound concern across communities and different generations of North Sydney. Most recently, I received the following email in response to an article about the carcinogens in our water supply. The author wrote, "How can we get some answers on the most disappointing and distressing article I have read? I've also heard Roundup chemicals are showing up in human breast milk. What can be done about this? At the same time, I've heard from many constituents keen to do the right thing, who struggle in the face of the collapse of RedCycle, the enormous amount of plastic they accumulate domestically, and the lack of convenient opportunities to environmentally dispose of such things as blister packs. I've had constituents who have written to me about the threat of microplastics in landfill remaining present for generations, and its increasing presence in marine and food supply structures, and about the prevalence of forever chemicals already banned in the EU in the durable water-resistant coating used on Australian jackets. That constituent wrote, "This coating is known as C6, or perfluorohexane sulfonic acid. It's supposed to be a nicer version of the more toxic C8, but appears to exhibit many of the same significant issues in terms of human health and damage to the environment. Due to our lax regulations, we risk, and already are, becoming a bit of a dumping ground for companies to get rid of their stocks of these chemicals, until we catch up with meaningful restrictions, which is really disappointing." Everyone who's reached out to me about this wants, more than anything, action. Overwhelmingly, the message from my community is threefold. 1, we're aware we're drowning in waste. 2, it's intolerable. And 3, we urgently need our government to act. The stakes are too high not to act, and this beautiful environment, so rich in diversity and the health of our next generations, is not ours to gamble with. The first crucial step has been taken. The vital work of the committee in holding hearings and inviting submissions and distilling the evidence into this sobering report with its 22 key recommendations. And I really want to thank the committee for their work and for bringing these recommendations, which represent a practical way for our government to channel the community's urgency for action into effect. Importantly, the committee's recommendations include the implementation of a national plan, include an annual report to Parliament on the progress of key actions from that plan, and include for the government to prioritise a sustainable end market for recovered plastics as a matter of urgency. The 7th recommendation for the government as a priority is to take a leadership role in coordinating and tracking actions in relation to the reduction of the use of plastics in the face of our woeful ranking as the second in the world for use of single-use plastics. Other recommendations, such as making it easier for consumers to recycle more effectively with effective labelling, developing and funding public awareness and education on proper recycling practices, commissioning of research to determine the impacts of microplastic ingestion, inhalation and skin contact on human health to be made publicly available. All are concrete actions which respond to the pressing concerns I hear from my community in this area. I urge the government to implement all of the committee's recommendations without delay. In particular, the first recommendation, that being to develop, through the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, and in consultation with the states and territories, industry and the community, an updated national plastics plan. Not in a future term of government, but now, in this final year of this term of the 47th Parliament. Please, do not let this report sit on a shelf, gathering a film of microplastics. I urge you, throw a drowning nation a rope and act now.
The member for Tangi.
I move that the debate be adjourned and the resumption of the debate be made and order of the day for the next sitting.
The question is that the debate be adjourned and a resumption of the debate be made in order of the next day for the next sitting. All of their opinions say aye. Aye. Against say no. I believe the ayes have it. Clerk.
Committee and Delegation Business, Order of the Day number 2, Standing Committee on Health, Aged Care and Sport, the state of diabetes mellitus in Australia in 2024, resumption of debate on the motion of the member for Macarthur.
The question is, I'll just get the right one. The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Australia, 1.5 million people live with diabetes. This is one of our country's most serious and important health issues for governments to address. The Health Committee's diabetes report, The State of Diabetes Mellitus in Australia in 2024, was tabled a few months ago in Parliament. The report uncovered the growing prevalence of diabetes right across the country. It is a public health imperative that we take immediate action on every form of diabetes that impacts the lives of Australians. I note the report acknowledges that type 1 diabetes can be triggered by COVID-19. It read, as part of the inquiry, the committee heard evidence discussing the possibility of a COVID-19 infection being an environmental trigger that could influence the development of type 1 or type 2 diabetes. Multiple submitters, including the Department of Health and Aged Care, referenced emerging evidence suggesting that there may be a link between COVID-19 and new onset type 1 and or type 2 diabetes, and I think now the research is clear that this is the case. As a mother of a son who developed type 1 diabetes shortly after having COVID-19 in 2022, it is heartening to know that this has been taken seriously by the committee. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the work of the incredible medical researchers who continue to investigate the triggers of autoimmune diseases and how we can best prevent, diagnose and manage these occurrences. As a Deputy Chair of the committee at the time of the inquiry, it was my strong desire that we maintained a tight focus on type 1 diabetes, particularly its impacts on young people. Regarding type 1 diabetes, I support all the recommendations that we handed down in the report. The report recommends further research funding into diabetes within the Australian context. This is needed for those with type 1, where research is the only way to a cure. The report also calls for more diabetes educators. The public health system is extremely stretched. As parliamentarians, we all know this from many stories we hear weekly from constituents. I experienced this firsthand, the need for more diabetes educators with my son's type 1 diagnosis, when Nepean Hospital in my electorate only had one type 1 diabetes educator for new patients. This story is the same right across Western Sydney for those with type 1. The daily work of diabetes educators is so important for those who have just been diagnosed and throughout their life. In terms of medical technology, there is a recommendation to extend constant glucose monitoring or CGM devices for all. Regarding insulin pumps, we've seen this Albanese Labor government cut choices available to those with type 1 to one product. This must change now, and we acknowledge this need in the report. Choice is pivotal for those with type 1 in ensuring they have access to the devices that work for them. I've strongly advocated for those with type 1 diabetes to have access to fully subsidised devices, giving those that are now 21 and above must make co-payments for these life-saving and needed daily products. Choice in devices and ongoing advances in medical technology is life-saving for those managing type 1 diabetes, and this cannot be understated. We need such ideas to be taken up by government so that the lives of those with this chronic illness are made easier. Every kid with type 1 deserves a device that works for them, so they can play sport with their friends in the playground and not worry and participate even at the most elite levels of sport as an athlete. There is no doubt that Australia has an epidemic in relation to type 2 diabetes. Some of the highest rates of type 2 diabetes are in Western Sydney and in my own electorate of Lindsay, spanning from Penrith to St Mary's. Urgent action needs to be taken to change this. This action spans all three levels of government, academia and community stakeholders. In terms of type 2 diabetes, I strongly support early intervention, especially the promotion of physical activity and healthy eating habits, which should be ingrained in the primary school curriculum. Type 2 diabetes is on the rise in our kids, and we need to counter this immediately. If we do not act now to stop the growth of type 2 for the next generation, we are going to see poorer life outcomes for many kids in low socioeconomic areas, and in particular, more pressure applied to our public health system. It is time for a new public health campaign to encourage healthy, active lifestyles with a focus on the prevention of type 2 diabetes. As a member for Lindsay, I started a healthy, active living network in my community when I was first elected in 2019. It is a passion of mine to ensure that every child and adult has a sport they want to play that is accessible to them, or even getting out and about and doing the river walk along the Nepean River. We need every policy lever pulling in the same direction in order to combat type 2. We need governments to step up and tackle this issue head on. Other factors like diet education is critical in all age groups to stop more diagnoses of type 2. Low carbohydrate diets need more attention in this respect. As a former Shadow Assistant Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, I fully support the recommendation for the government to review access for juvenile mental health for those with diabetes. Kids with type 1 often feel disengaged and feel they can't participate in so much. This is the same, of course, for children with type 2. There is a psychological element of diabetes that our young people must combat every day. The report noted diabetes patients make more than 180 diabetes-related decisions a day. That is extraordinary. I thank my fellow committee members for their work on this report and their expertise, as many are doctors, including the chair and my good friend, the member for Macarthur, and others like the members for Higgins, Kooyong, McKellar and Robertson. I also want to thank the member for Barara for taking on the deputy chair position of the committee as I became the shadow minister and was made a supplementary member for the remainder of the inquiry. I want to especially thank the members of the committee from Western Sydney, including the members from Hughes, Macarthur and Werriwa. You all have an acute understanding of how type 2 impacts our communities and our health systems. And I also want to acknowledge the late member for Dunkley, Peter Murphy, for her contribution to the committee's work. Finally, I would like to give a shout out to a clinician on the front line in Western Sydney, Dr. Catherine Williams, whose work in obesity in its most severe forms is extraordinary. I thank her for her ongoing advocacy in type 2 and obesity research as well. Thank you very much.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Moreton.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I've been involved with the Parliamentary Friends for the Prevention of Diabetes for my entire time in politics, and I was elected in 2007. I'm currently co-chair with my good friend, the member for Grey. We wanted to name that group the Enemies of Diabetes, but we weren't allowed to. But over the past year, I've had an additional focus seconded for membership of the Health Committee for the Parliamentary Inquiry into Diabetes. This year-long inquiry had nearly 500 submissions and met with stakeholders all around the country. I just want to do a particular call-out to Dr Mike, who chaired that committee, and all of the other committee members that were so warm and welcoming. But the member for Macarthur, Dr Mike Freelander, this report is a testament to your incredible leadership. And I really want that to be on the record, that it is a real recipe for how this nation can go forward. And I want to thank you. Thank you for lending me that report, my prop, that I'll give back to Dr Mike, who did an incredible job. Because that State of Diabetes Mellitus in Australia in 2024 report, only released last month, comes at a time when diabetes is the fastest growing chronic or non-communicable disease in Australia. Tsunami. The report has 23 recommendations and highlights the health and economic costs of diabetes. It also provides insight into the proposed next steps in handling what Diabetes Australia calls the epidemic of the 21st century and the biggest challenge confronting Australia's health system, which is an incredible statement. We know that diabetes affects people in all communities across the country, some disproportionately, and that access to services is not equitable. I developed this interest in diabetes because my mum was a type 2 diabetic. The report points out that to combat diabetes we need to focus not only on prevention but on education, on agriculture, on manufacturing, amongst many other things. I'd like to focus on the report's fourth recommendation today, which states the committee recommends that the Australian Government implements a levy on sugar-sweetened beverages such that the price is modelled on international best practice and the anticipated improvement of health outcomes. The levy should be graduated according to the sugar content." End quote. That's the committee's fourth recommendation. In December 2022, the World Health Organization released its first global tax manual for sugar-sweetened beverages, also known as SSBs. As of February 2023, 106 countries and territories had implemented a sugar levy. These included the United Kingdom, France, South Africa and many of our Pacific neighbours. The application of a levy on sugar-sweetened beverages is proven to reduce demand and have a positive effect on health outcomes. I was shocked when I learned that Australians drink more than 2.4 billion litres of sugary drinks each year. That's an average of 92 litres per person. I think my sons are doing their bit to keep those averages up. These are drinks like flavoured milk, soft drinks, energy drinks, fruit juices and vitamin waters. They are flavoured with sweeteners such as sucrose, high fructose corn syrup or fruit juice concentrate. The Australian Medical Association describes them as containing a high number of liquid calories which provide almost no nutritional benefit. People who regularly consume these kinds of drinks have an increased risk of developing debilitating and even terminal health issues. These can range from dental cavities to weight gain and obesity to heart disease, stroke and type 2 diabetes. Deputy Speaker, there are approximately 1.5 million Australians living with all types of known diagnosed diabetes. 87% of these people have type 2 diabetes. That's a staggering 1.3 million people, 1.3 million Australians. And Diabetes Australia believes a further 500,000 people are living with undiagnosed type 2 diabetes. The inquiry showed that treating type 2 diabetes is placing a significant burden on Australia's health resources. It affects numerous branches of medicine, such as obstetrics, paediatrics, which I think Dr Mike might know a little bit about, neurology, cardiology, vascular surgery, ophthalmology and geriatrics. Type 2 diabetes has strong genetic and family-related risk factors, but is also often caused by modifiable lifestyle choices. People can slow or stop the progression of the condition by changing their diet and increasing the amount of exercise that they do. Being overweight can contribute to the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and the introduction of a levy on SSBs would help work to diminish this risk. Last year, the Australian Medical Association had this to say about a sugar levy, and I quote, "Our analysis projects this tax would reduce consumption by 31% by 2025-26, and it's estimated to result in 16,000 fewer cases of type 2 diabetes, 4,400 fewer cases of heart disease and 1,100 fewer cases of stroke. It is a simple but effective way to improve the lives of Australians." End quote. The AMA also told the inquiry to effect a change in SSB consumption, both a clear message for consumers that the product is unhealthy and a tangible deterrent are warranted. A tax can deliver on both counts by creating a price signal that the product is unhealthy and reducing consumption through higher prices and therefore lower affordability. Furthermore, an appropriately designed tax can also incentivise manufacturers of SSBs to reformulate their products to contain less free sugar, which is actually what has happened throughout the world. Manufacturers are still making drinks, still putting them into supermarkets, still selling them to customers, but there's just less sugar consumed. Of course, simply implementing a levy on SSBs will not solve the type 2 diabetes problem. I'm a big believer in community infrastructure that gets communities moving because of all the benefits that flow from that. Communities are safer, there's less crime, there's better connections, less chance of any fear and division campaign taking hold in a community where people are out there exercising together, sharing meals together, making friendships together, watching sports together. There are numerous other factors, such as an active lifestyle and education on and access to healthier food choices at play. However, reducing sugar intake through a levy on sugar-sweetened beverages is an important piece of this puzzle, and one that I believe should be implemented. And I say that as someone coming from the Sunshine State, with all of my in-laws living in far north Queensland. But Dr Mike Freelander, the member for Macarthur, again, I thank you for your leadership in this committee and for letting me work with the Health Committee on such an important inquiry. And I commend the document for everyone to read.
I thank the member. The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I too would like to acknowledge the great work done by the member for Macarthur, the Chair of the Health Committee, in undertaking and bringing this report to completion. It's a really important one. I'd also like to acknowledge my medical colleagues on the Health Committee, the members for Higgins, McKellar and Robertson, and the two deputy chairs of the committee, the members for Barara and for Lindsay, and other members of the committee, but particularly the former member for Dunkley, Peter Murphy, who is much missed by all of us. on that committee.
Order. A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. Now, the member for Kooyong in continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. 1 in 20 Australians, that's 1.5 million people, lives with diabetes. That is a number which continues to increase. Unfortunately and terrifyingly, this country now faces an epidemic of diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is by far the most common form. In Australia, it is much more likely to affect people of lower socio-economic standing. They're people who often have less access to clean water and affordable fresh food, less time and less space for regular physical activity, and often less access to good quality health care. In particular, First Nations peoples globally, but particularly in Australia, have a frighteningly high incidence of diabetes. They develop it at a younger age, and their progression to often life-threatening complications is frighteningly rapid. Diabetes is the leading contributor to the gap in life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are nearly 5 times more likely to be hospitalised for diabetes-related complications. Diabetes is the leading cause of death for Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. The reasons for this are complex, and they include both genetic predisposition and a whole raft of socio-economic factors. But many of our policy settings could be adjusted to immediately improve protections for First Nations and other vulnerable Australians. The first of these is the urgent need for action on our diet. Australians eat too many ultra-processed foods and too many foods with added sugar and hidden chemicals. Unhealthy foods represent a third of Australian children's diets. 1 in 4 Australian children is either overweight or obese. Most Australians just don't understand how much sugar is added to our food. The regulation of food manufacturers in this country is rubbish, whether we're talking about dietary codes for infant formulas or the health star ratings that we apply to other foods. Parents often think that they're feeding their kids healthy food, but products which are labelled as containing no added sugar can still contain added sugars in the forms of gels, pastes or purees. Only 22% of the infant and toddler foods stocked in Australian supermarkets actually meet nutritional standards of the World Health Organization. In particular, many breast milk substitutes, or what we call toddler milks or toddler formulas, are effectively just sugary drinks. Labelling codes for those drinks and for other foodstuffs in this country are voluntary. Only 41% of products on our supermarket shelves display health star ratings, and there's a reason for that. The manufacturers of healthy products use them as a marketing tool, but others, the unhealthy foods, just decide not to display a score. The star system is also problematic in and of itself, though. It doesn't distinguish between natural sugars and added sweeteners. It actually gives higher ratings to ultra-processed foods and lower ratings to whole foods. We urgently need a mandatory food labelling scheme which will be able to provide accurate and clear health information to consumers when they buy food for themselves and for their families. Now, the Health Committee also recommended that the Australian Government should implement a levy graduated according to the sugar content of sugar-sweetened beverages. These are sports drinks, soft drinks, energy drinks, vitamin waters. These drinks cause weight gain, but they have limited nutritional value. They carry calories, but not much else. A levy on these soft drinks would encourage industry to reformulate those drinks, and it would lessen their consumption in the same way that similar measures have decreased consumption of tobacco and of alcohol in Australia. More than 35 public health organisations have now asked the government to do this, to levy a sugar-sweetened beverage tax in this country, but the major political parties, sadly, are not listening. Data from 85 international jurisdictions has shown that that sort of levy is effective in decreasing sugar consumption. In fact, a recent study in the US showed a 40% decrease in gestational diabetes and a corresponding improvement in obstetric outcomes like low birth weight after imposition of a sugary drink levy. And that was within a couple of years of that intervention. Gestational diabetes is a real worry for Australia because it affects not only the women who have it, who are at increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes in later life, it also has permanent and ongoing implications for the children who sit in the mum's tum while that mum has diabetes during pregnancy. So earmarking the revenue from the levy, a sugar-sweetened beverage levy, would be an immediate way of identifying funds which could help with public health measures, and that would help engender public support for this concept. Deputy Speaker, it was a great privilege to be a member of the parliamentary committee which investigated diabetes in Australia, but I have to say that much of what we heard was confronting and difficult, and it's very clear that this scourge is something which is going to be a huge challenge for all of our healthcare systems in the years to come. The efforts of that committee will be wasted if this government does not act on the committee's findings. The committee visited some First Nations communities in which we saw people with minimal access to fresh fruit and to vegetables, people who couldn't access affordable drinkable water. We saw communities where children were carrying around 2-litre bottles of Coke because it was cheaper than the bottled water, that was the only other source of fluid that they could access. We could help those people, those communities, in the simplest and most fundamental of ways. We could improve the regulation of the food and drinks industry in this country. But if we don't, we will all bear the cost of that and the loss associated with this plague that the diabetes epidemic represents.
Thank the member. The question is that the document be noted, and I call a member for Macarthur.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I seek leave to speak again on this report, having spoken very briefly at its presentation at the end of June.
Is leave granted?
Leave is granted.
Call the member.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. This report of the Standing Committee on Health, Aged Care and Sport took over 18 months, and we heard from people all around the country about what is a public health emergency, and that is diabetes in Australia. We know that there are approximately 150,000 people with type 1 diabetes and over 1.5 million people with type 2 diabetes and more than that number with pre-diabetes. So it's a major public health emergency. We have seen that almost 50% of presentations to our emergency departments are related to diabetes in some way, be it with complications like renal failure, cardiovascular disease, retinal disease with visual impairment, to all the other long-term complications of diabetes, leading to huge pressure on our health system. Peripheral vascular disease that is preventable is often a presentation of people with type 2 diabetes. We are doing more amputations in Australia than we should be because of this scourge of diabetes. So it's a huge burden on our health system. And the importance of this inquiry is to look as to how we could change this, this narrative and this trajectory, because if we don't, our health system will not be able to cope. We've already seen in areas like the Northern Territory this scourge of renal failure, even at a relatively young age, people in their 20s with renal failure requiring dialysis because of type 2 diabetes. The trajectory is very bad. In my medical lifetime, we've seen persistent increases in life expectancies every year. In the lifetime of my parents, similar has been true, and my grandparents. But we are now in a time where in the developed world, life expectancies are plateauing. So the increases in life expectancy that have been seen for over 3 generations are now changing. And in some states in America, they're actually seeing decreases in male and female life expectancies. And one of the big causes of this in the developed world is diabetes. And in particular, diabetes is affecting those in disadvantaged communities. And we see this in Australia. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes, not type 1 diabetes, but type 2 diabetes tracks disadvantage. We see this in the outer suburbs of our major capital cities, in Western and Southwestern Sydney, like electorates like mine, Macarthur, electorates like Fowler, Werriwa, etc., and Lindsay. There are very high incidences of diabetes. And this is putting enormous pressure not just on our health system, but on our social security system, even on our education system, with many adolescents now presenting with obesity and type 2 diabetes. This is very prevalent, as has already been mentioned, in our Indigenous community, but it's now appearing in our Pacific Islander community, and now also in our subcontinental communities. The increased incidence of obesity and type 2 diabetes causing major health complications. I started at Campbelltown Hospital, our type 1 paediatric diabetes clinic 30 years ago. It was becoming apparent then that the management of diabetes was very complex and required a team approach, and it was difficult to provide that in private practice. We started our type 1 diabetes clinic at Campbelltown Hospital many years ago, in the 1990s, in fact. But then, about 10 or 12 years ago, we started to see an increasing number of children presenting with obesity and type 2 diabetes. And as we've travelled around our communities in outer metropolitan areas, rural areas, regional areas, and in particular in Indigenous communities in remote areas, we are finding this problem of early onset type 2 diabetes. And this is causing early trajectory towards complications like vascular disease, blindness, kidney failure. And these communities are now being devastated by the numbers of adolescents and young adults who are presenting with type 2 diabetes and all its complications. This trajectory has to be changed. It's bad for the communities, it's bad for the wider Australian society, and it's something that we need to reverse if we are going to see a return to continuing increases in life expectancy in a well-developed and wealthy society like Australia. Hence the report. The report is very important in the 23 recommendations, and they've already been spoken about, some controversial, some not, but they need to be taken in their entirety. And we don't want this report to be left on a shelf gathering dust. It's now my job to take this around the country, and I'll be speaking to state health departments, state health ministers, about how we can get implementation of the recommendations in this inquiry. As I said, there are 23 of them. Some of them require some investment, but that investment will reap financial rewards if we can turn this epidemic around, and that is now my job. It is a public health emergency, as I've said, and it requires a public health response which can only be led by governments, and governments of all persuasions, from local government, state government and federal governments. I think that if we are going to turn this around, it is going to require action as soon as possible, and that is going to depend on many of the committee members who gave of their time and their efforts in the inquiry. In particular, I would like to thank the co-opted members, Graham Perrott, the member for Moreton, and Sophie Scomps, the member for Mackellar, who were co-opted to the committee, as well as my medical colleagues and non-medical colleagues on the committee. I'd like to also pay tribute to Peter Murphy, who was a member of our committee till her death. She very well understood the social determinants of health and was committed to our inquiry and was a big part of our recommendations. I'd like to thank all the many people who provided submissions to our inquiry from Diabetes Australia, JDRF, all the major medical institutes provided supports for us. In particular, I'd like to single out the Grattan Institute, who provided a very comprehensive view of the the social issues involved with type 2 diabetes and obesity, and all the other institutes in places like Darwin and the Northern Territory, where the Menzies Institute were able to provide very good evidence of the difficulties that diabetes was causing in remote and rural communities. I would like to thank all the kind words that my fellow committee members have said about the report, and myself in particular, but I'd like to stress that this is a report of the whole committee, and I'm incredibly grateful for all the work they put in this, what I think is a very important inquiry and a very important recommendations. I'm committed to making sure that we have uptake of those recommendations. I know the Health Minister has very favourably looked upon our recommendations and is doing his best to help with the inquiry recommendations adoption. We know that prevention has to be the main aim. If we continue on this trajectory of increases in the number of people with diabetes, our health system will be put under unbelievable pressure and other health priorities will suffer. I commend the report to the Parliament, and I will commit to continuing to impress upon those in power of the importance of taking up these recommendations. Thank you.
I thank the member. Call the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Speaker. I move that the debate be adjourned and the resumption of the debate be made in order of the day for the next sitting.
The question is that the debate be adjourned and the resumption of the debate be made in order of the day for the next sitting. All of those of that opinion say aye. Against?
You'll need a seconder of the motion.
No.
No?
Next one, not this one. This is just the end of that notation.
I was going to move that the member have a time extension. His speech was so good.
Member for Fisher will resume his seat. Thank you. I think the ayes have it. Call the member for Hunter.
I move that the Federation Chamber do now be adjourned.
Is there a seconder for the motion?
Well, if the
is there a seconder for the motion?
Well, if I can't get my motion for an extension of time, I'll second the motion.
The question is the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. The country say no. I think the ayes have it. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning.